The letter arrived on thick, expensive parchment-like paper, the kind that felt like a wedding invitation but carried the weight of a subpoena. Sarah Jensen plucked it from the mailbox, her good mood from a morning walk with Buster evaporating. "Mark," she called into the house, her voice tight. "Another one." Mark emerged from his garage workshop, wiping grease from his hands. He didn't need to ask. The Crestmere Hills Homeowners Association communique was unmistakable. He took it, broke the seal, and scanned the contents. His face, usually calm and thoughtful, hardened into a mask of cold fury. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her stomach clenching. "It's about Buster," Mark said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Violation 12C. Unsanctioned animal of a non-decorative size. They're fining us $500 and demanding we rehomed the animal within 10 days. He's a Labrador. He's not a decorative gnome." Sarah's voice cracked. Buster, hearing his name, thumped his tail against the floor inside. "This is because of Henderson. I saw him glaring when Buster chased a squirrel near his precious rose bushes." Carl Henderson was the president of the Crestmere Ho, a man who wore polo shirts with the collars permanently popped and believed his position granted him feudal lordship over their 37 houses. They fought it, of course. They attended the next board meeting, a sterile affair in the community clubhouse that smelled of lemon-scented disinfectant and thinly veiled contempt. They presented Buster veterinary records, his canine good citizen certificate, letters from neighbors who adored him. Henderson, flanked by his sycophantic board members, listened with a patronizing smile. "Mark, Sarah," he said, steepling his fingers. "The rules are clear. Buster exceeds the 25-inch shoulder height limit. We can't make exceptions. It sets a precedent. This is about preserving property values and community standards." It was a sham, and everyone knew it. The rule was one of hundreds of obscure bylaws buried in the 200-page CCRS covenants, conditions, and restrictions that no one had ever fully read. 10 days later, the nightmare happened. While Mark and Sarah were at work, an animal control truck, called in by an anonymous complaint, arrived. Their gardener, who had a key to water the plants, had let Buster into the backyard. The gate latch, which had been perfectly fine that morning, was mysteriously faulty. Buster, ever friendly, trotted up to the animal control officers. They seized him. The phone call from a frantic neighbor shattered Sarah's afternoon. They raced home to an empty, silent house. A notice was taped to their door, citing violation of the rehoming order. That was the breaking point. Grief turned to a cold, focused rage. That night, surrounded by tear-stained tissues, Mark didn't suggest a lawyer. Instead, he went to his study and returned with a thick, leather-bound binder. "The Crestmere Hills Ho CCRS. They want to play by the rules," Mark said, his eyes glinting with an uncharacteristic light. "Then we'll play by the rules. Every single one." Sarah looked at him, saw the determination, and nodded, her own sorrow hardening into resolve. "Where do we start?" They spent the next week not mourning, but studying. They became scholars of the absurd. They pored over every clause, every subsection, every footnote. They discovered rules that made the height restriction seem reasonable. Phase 1, the audit. The first shot across the bow was a formally notarized letter to the Ho Board, citing bylaw 44F, which gave any homeowner the right to a full and complete compliance audit of any and all common areas and board member properties, to be conducted at a time of the homeowner's choosing, with 48 hours' notice. Henderson scoffed and approved it, likely expecting nothing. He was wrong. On a bright Saturday morning, Mark and Sarah, armed with clipboards, laser measures, and a digital camera, began their inspection. They started with Henderson's own immaculate home, Mr. Henderson, Mark said politely, pointing to Henderson's mailbox. Bylaw 8 of Section 3. All residential mailboxes must be of the approved Crestmere colonial model, painted in heritage black. Yours appears to be a slightly different shade. I'd call it satin noir. Well noted. Henderson's smile faltered. Sarah, meanwhile, was measuring the height of his grass. Bylaw 11b. Lawn turf shall be maintained at a height no greater than 2.5 inches and no less than 2 inches. Your lawn is at 1.8 inches. This stresses the grass and can lead to brown spots, negatively affecting community aesthetics. They moved to the common areas. This park bench, Mark announced loudly, drawing the attention of neighbors out for a walk, is 3.2 inches too close to the sidewalk, violating the pathway clearance statute, 17D. A serious tripping hazard. The audit report they submitted was 15 pages long. It documented 47 violations on Henderson's property alone, and over 100 in the common areas. The fines, if levied, would be astronomical. Phase 2, the siege. The board tried to dismiss the audit as harassment, but Mark and Sarah were just warming up. They began enforcing bylaws that had been ignored for decades, targeting only the board members and their allies. They cited Brenda Klein, the treasurer, for bylaw 23G. The hanging of seasonal wreaths is permitted only during the 30-day period preceding the holiday. Your autumn-themed wreath has been up for 42 days. They reported Vice President Miller of bylaw 39. Vehicles may not be washed in driveways between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. on weekends to prevent water runoff. They had timestamped photos of him washing his BMW at 11:03 a.m. on a Sunday. They invoked bylaw 5H, which prohibited the use of non-native, non-drought-resistant shrubs in front yard landscaping. Half the board had illegal hydrangeas. The fines started piling up. The board's meetings became chaotic shouting matches. Henderson tried to have the Jensens' audit rights revoked, but Mark calmly cited bylaw 44F, subsection 2, which stated that any motion to amend audit rights required a 75% majority vote of all homeowners, not just the board. They were trapped by their own bureaucracy. Phase 3, the masterstroke. The coup de grace came from the deepest, dustiest corner of the CCRS. Bylaw 88C, the Architectural Review Committee must approve, in writing, any and all alterations to a property's visual footprint, including, but not limited to, permanent landscaping, structures, and color changes. One evening, Mark and Sarah walked the neighborhood with a new purpose. They stopped at Henderson's house. Over the summer, he had installed a stunning new stone patio, complete with a built-in gas fire pit. It was the envy of the neighborhood. It had never been submitted to the ARC for approval. The next formal letter was a masterpiece. It politely informed the board that, due to a significant, unapproved structural alteration to the president's property, they were invoking bylaw 88C, which mandated that the violation be rectified. The patio, the letter stated, must be removed and the land returned to its original state within 30 days. Henderson was apoplectic. He screamed that it was ridiculous. But the rule was there, in black and white. The Jensens had already filed a lien against his property to ensure compliance, a perfectly legal maneuver outlined in the bylaws. The other board members, drowning in their own fines and petty citations, saw the writing on the wall. Their own homes were under siege. At an emergency meeting from which Henderson was forcibly excluded, a questionable maneuver based on a creatively interpreted bylaw about conflicts of interest, they voted to settle. The offer was simple. All fines against the Jensens and all other homeowners would be dropped. The hated pet height restriction would be repealed. And, most importantly, the Ho would use its funds to compensate the Jensens for their emotional distress. A sum that was just enough to cover the adoption fee for a very specific Labrador that had been languishing in the city shelter since the day Buster was taken. A week later, a new board was elected by a landslide. Mark and Sarah declined a nomination. They had won. On a cool autumn evening, Mark and Sarah sat on their porch, a porch that now proudly displayed a slightly off-regulation welcome mat and a wilting wreath that had been up for 6 weeks. A large, goofy Labrador lay at their feet, chewing contentedly on a toy. They watched as a construction crew, paid for by Carl Henderson, began the arduous task of jackhammering his beautiful patio into rubble. The sound was loud, disruptive, and deeply, profoundly satisfying. Sarah reached over and took Mark's hand. "You know," she said, a gentle smile on her face, "I think the community standards are finally looking up." Mark smiled back, watching the sunset paint the sky behind the noise and the dust. "It's all about preserving property values, dear,"